and then we're going to do an update on water and the initiative that they're working on, and that'll really be the majority of what we do today. And then anybody that's up for giving an update next go around, which it might be us, because let me just share my screen here. This is the list of folks that we've got so far. And the ones in green are folks that we've confirmed. So as far as folks that are working on a particular improvement initiative as utility partners, we've got DC Water with Gitachu and Duncan, myself with KC Water. We've also got a few other folks, like I mentioned, Zach is working with me. I probably need to move him over with me on this side. And then Zanetta from Louisville MSD is working on their CIP delivery, moving their as is documentation to a 2B development of their business process model. We're going to focus on project closeout, and DC Water is moving forward with implementation of their pilot BCE improvements. So that's the 4 folks that we've got working on initiatives. We've got a few other folks that have expressed some interest that depending on follow-ups and what they're interested in doing, they may join in with San Francisco, and we've got Loudon Water listed in Baltimore and Charlotte. So those are still kind of question marks if they're going to do something this year or not. And then we've got a number of folks, Jeff and Martin, you guys included, that are continuing to participate, which is awesome. And then Tasha is working with Jennie over there at Tacoma Water. And I don't want to miss anybody. So if you know of anybody else, feel free to let me know, and we'll get them on the list. But that's just an update on where we're at with the initiatives and folks that are working on things, and that's great. So, Cello or Scott or anybody else, any other kind of updates before we just kind of dive in?
No, I think that it would just be good to let people know that you did a really great job at the WEFTEC WISE workshop, and you and Duncan had a presentation and a session, so that went really well. I know that you're not going to pat yourself on the back, so I have to, and say they did a really great job. So it was really good.
Yeah, thank you, Chili. Yeah, it was a good. Yeah, as I thank you for reminding me that the WEFTEC workshop last week was on the Sunday before yesterday. And it was a full day workshop, and it was a great job by all the presenters. I was glad to participate. I learned a lot about where things are at with some of the other teams that are working on workforce and culture, change management, and technology as well. And then Duncan and I, as Cello mentioned, gave a presentation on the CIP delivery, CIP planning and delivery, what we've been up to, and yeah, so we had some good feedback from some folks that may be interested in joining in the future. So that was good.
And you made it safely. And you made
we
it.
All, yeah, yes. So very good. All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Jennie. So take it away, Jennie. I know you've been working on your guys's ongoing improvements with your CIP planning process, and you had mentioned too your organization's gone through some changes, and as I understand it, you've been doing some training and education meetings with your staff on the CIP planning process, and so take it away and share with us what you've been up to.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. As Dan mentioned, we had some ongoing improvement initiatives at Tacoma Water going on. So I'm going to spend some time this morning sharing with you what our context was specific to Tacoma Water and how the WISE work really complemented that effort. and how you might be able to integrate that with your utility, because there's different ways to incorporate what we're learning in these meetings too, depending on what's going on at your own utility. Just a little bit of context, Tacoma Water is a mid-sized utility south of Seattle. And get you back on my screen. And I'm a process analyst in our planning and engineering group. And I'll share a little bit more about some of the changes that we've been undergoing. So some background, as Dan mentioned, we had some significant changes at the beginning of 2020. We had a Tacoma Water reorg that reorganized all of our employees into different sections and operating groups that had been in process for probably years. We don't reorg very often, and one of the significant impacts of that reorganization was 3 functional engineering teams, supply, distribution, and quality, were combined into one planning and engineering group. So January 1st, 2020, we have one new planning and engineering group wondering how does work flow now through our new org process. The same day that we started a reorg, we had a new section manager start. So her first day is the reorg, and that's how we started 2020. And so significant changes. As you know, we also had other changes in spring of 2020. And so it wasn't until June that planning and engineering leadership team got together for a virtual workshop to address the gaps that this reorg revealed, to answer the question, well, how does work flow? What do we need to focus on to understand our new current state business process? And the results of that workshop are on the screen on the right, of a level of effort and a level of impact of different initiatives that we could tackle. And in the upper right, there were 4 identified as high impact but high effort. That the leadership team said, you know, we really want to prioritize this work effort because we think if we work on these high level, high impact, the other initiatives will kind of fall in. And we folded that in, and our approach then was to create 4 what we called continuous improvement teams. And continuous improvement is something the city of Tacoma has a methodology for that I'll share on a later slide, but that's a language that some in our work group were familiar with and could capitalize on. And those 4 continuous improvement teams were, this is really key from a change management effort. We identified those members of those teams by asking for people to self-nominate from our engineering group. Are you interested in one of these teams? So that we had a broad level of support and diverse representation in these teams to initiate these changes. And those 4 continuous improvement teams comprised of about 4 to 5 members per team, which is around 25 members total out of 50 staff in engineering. So half of our staff were involved in this continuous improvement effort. And we kicked off our continuous improvement in January of 21, and we've just finished our implementation now in September. So I'm going to walk through what that process looked like and then how we align that to the WISE effort. So what were those 4 focus areas, those high impact, high effort activities in the continuous improvement teams? One was a desire to develop an intake process. How do we identify the work that engineering needs to engage, particularly our capital and O&M work, especially in this new environment where in the past you might just call an engineer, send an email. Well, who do I talk to now that you're all in one engineering group? The second was defining our roles and responsibilities. So very similar to the process maps we've seen with stage gates, who's doing what and those swim lanes. We need to understand where the handoffs are between system and asset planning, the team that I'm a part of, project delivery, water resource planning. How does that work flow and where are those stage gates? And then the third, which is very applicable to this group, refining our project prioritization process. How do we identify our high critical work that we need to do? And then finally, our catch-all that I won't touch on much, but it was wrapped up into this effort, was our documented solutions for knowledge gaps. That was pretty vague, pretty closely that team focused on how we organize our project files on our shared drive. So I won't talk too much about that one, but it was all rolled up into this effort. So our methodology, I mentioned that the city of Tacoma has our own continuous improvement methodology. It's called our CI/4I process, and we have a continuous improvement office in the city of Tacoma that organizes this methodology by looking at lean principles or like, what's the other word? I'm forgetting, it's spacing on it now, but the lean and green belt training, that sort of principles to identify what they call the CI/4I, which is initiate, investigate, improve, and implement. And there's a training that they provide. And so a few of us in the engineering group had gone through that training and knew that these tools existed. And they're very similar to the methodology of WISE, of understanding your current state before you make changes and improvements to your future state, and focusing on implementation and change management in that last improve phase. And so this map, what this shows is how all 4 teams use the same tools at each stage to identify what is it that you want to focus on as the problem. Understand very clearly at the beginning, what are you trying to fix? What's the problem? And then on the investigate phase, how do you know it's a problem? And this is where you would develop a current state process map and do some root cause analysis. And then once you understand what the problem is, you can address it with a future state process map and then implementation. And each one of these items in bold, we had a template for each group to be able to use in the same fashion. And I'll show a little bit of that in one of the next slides. But I just wanted to highlight here that as I was in our workshops all last year, I saw that this really was related to the WISE methodology of understanding your current condition, identifying your areas for improvement, design your to-be state, and then how you can then create a plan for implementation. And so this is just to show that there might be ongoing efforts at your utility that the WISE work can complement, and you can translate it for your utility to maybe some internal language you already have. I wanted to highlight that I'm a process analyst. I love a good swim lane diagram, but that's not what everyone loves on our engineering team. And so meeting people where they're at, when we first ask them to document the current state, there's sometimes some resistance. Why do we need to document the current state? We're a new org. We want to look towards the future. And doing that in a swim lane diagram was difficult for some of the participants. And so we decided to use a more simple process called a CIPOC diagram. And the CIPOC stands for the supplier, the input, the process itself, and then the output and the customers. And this is a more simplified version of trying to get at your current state. And we developed some training around this where we talked about how to make a grilled cheese sandwich as an example to then apply towards this. So when you're thinking about making a grilled cheese sandwich, your supplier is whoever's providing the material. So Safeway, Fred Meyer, Kroger, they're giving you the bread and the cheese. So identifying who's supplying that. What's the input? That might be the bread and the cheese itself. The process could be, you grill the grilled cheese and you put it on each side, and some people that might be 1 step, some people it's going to be 9 steps, depending on the level of detail. And then your output is a grilled cheese and your customer is whoever eats it. And that was the training that we provided for the teams, is helping them understand how to document the current state and then use this diagram to understand for their particular process, the suppliers, the customers, and then the process. This particular CIPOC is on project prioritization. So it was identifying from the current state who was doing prioritization within our work group, how they were providing those inputs. Was it lists? Was it formalized? What that process was. So this is just one tool that you could Google that might be helpful if for your organization, sitting down and mapping out the current state process isn't something that is going to meet your customers where they're at. And then the other tool I want to highlight is a fishbone diagram, also called an Ishikawa diagram or a 5 whys. And the whole purpose of this is you might have a problem that in our case, we don't always spend our budget. And so what's the reason for that? And often the first reason given isn't really the root cause of that reason. And if you're going to develop a future state, you might want to understand the root cause a bit more. And so the analogy here is be a toddler. Okay, why Why? You ask 5 whys. So if the budget is underspent, it's because we're in silos. Well, why are we in silos? And you try to dig deeper into those, understanding your root causes. So those were 2 tools that we use that I think were helpful in our understanding our current state and analyzing that state. Our to-be process, this is what ended up as our future state. And what I wanted to highlight here is that as we communicated this out when we were doing our training, it was really important that we highlight that this process was not that different than the current state. So when we did our current state analysis, we found that the future state was going to be pretty much the same process steps at the top, but how and the mechanisms were going to be different. So in the past, you would make a request to your engineer, to someone in water quality or supply or distribution. That might be a phone call, that might be an email. Well, instead of making that request individually to a specific person, we are using a cloud-based solution for those requests as a centralized intake. And in the past, your request would be routed as appropriate. Well, we now have that in a more documented, centralized location. And then there in the past was a review process. In the current state, there's a review process. It's just more formalized, and so on and so forth. So the idea being here, when we were doing our training and communication, we really wanted to highlight that the future state was not that different than the current state. And we were trying to be more formalized about how we were doing each of these steps. One of the things that we did introduce, which I'll talk a little bit about, is in this review phase, we introduced a project charter. So in our current state, we were using BCEs, and we're continuing to use BCEs. And some of you have seen from a few years ago our short and long form BCEs. Those are still something that we will utilize. But as a step between that, we're developing a project charter after a submission is submitted to our intake process. And the project charter is a 2-page scope, schedule, budget. And I have a bit more on that on a later slide. So our intake process, again, I mentioned, is through an online system. We use Smartsheet here at Tacoma Water. So that's how we have a form online that people submit their request for a potential capital project. We really should do something about this Puyallup River Bridge, or our ozone generator is aging and we're not sure if we should replace it or refurbish it. So those are the kind of submissions that go into our intake. They're routed to our system planning team. They're reviewed and a project charter is developed, and that charter then is what our sponsors can approve and then prioritize. And then the last stage is creating that file structure. And I'll talk a bit more about that review phase and prioritization. So I mentioned I like a good swim lane diagram. So behind all of the high level process map, there was this swim lane diagram. So I wanted to go through to share a little bit more about what that looks like, because I thought this audience might enjoy a little more process details. So our intake is submitted by our customers. And then what this is highlighting here, the main takeaway is we have a system planning group. So as I mentioned, I'm in system and asset planning. And our system planning group was a new group as a result of our reorg. And so some of this work really identified and clarified the role of our system planning team could play in standardizing that review of intake submissions, so they have that comprehensive system perspective. And so the system planning team is reviewing the submissions weekly and identifying a review team lead. And the review team lead is someone from system planning, and that review team lead that assembles a review team of subject matter experts. And that review team here then completes that charter. And the goal, this is really important for us going forward, is that that review team is developing that charter in one meeting, no more than 2 hours. So providing really clear expectations for our subject matter experts that this is not a long process. That was part of the challenge of the current state with the BCE, is that sometimes you're doing a higher level of analysis than was required at that initial stage. And then that charter, again, is approved through this process, through our sponsor, and there's a stage gate for the section manager to provide approval over a certain dollar threshold. And once they've gone through this process, that's the end of the initiation process. And what I didn't show here is in the design phase, at 30% design is when a BCE would be required for specific projects over a certain threshold. And I see Scott has his hands up, but I just wanted to highlight that at Tacoma Water, planning and engineering does not own our business case evaluation process. It's managed by our financial stewardship group. So that was a key thing that we don't have control over. And we wanted to provide a kind of stage gate before things got to financial stewardship of justification and prioritization.
Jenny has Scott has a hands up. I think maybe he wants to pose a question.
I was just going to ask you on the sponsor side, where do the sponsors come from, and who initiates these projects then?
Yeah, so who initiates the projects, the customers come from maintenance and construction, other sections, source water treatment operations, internally within engineering. And then the sponsor is identified by that review team, depending on the scope of the project. So some projects, when they come in, we think it's going to be electrical, but turns out it's water quality, or depending on what the scope of the work is. So that review team identifies the sponsor, and the sponsor is any one of the planning and engineering leadership team members. So there's
okay,
five
it is in planning and engineering become the sponsors then.
Yes, so all sponsors are within planning and engineering, and anything that might require significant collaboration with another section, our section manager then is the sponsor, so she can provide that connection to those other managers and other work groups.
Okay.
Any other questions before I move forward?
Yeah, Jenny, this is Dan. I guess maybe provide just at least for you guys, a difference between, and you maybe kind of mentioned this, the difference between a charter and the business case evaluation.
Yeah, I think the chart, I have the charter in another couple pages. So the charter is really a high level scope, schedule, budget. It does not include a net present value analysis or that higher level analysis of the project that our business case evaluation does. And so our business case evaluations tend to be longer and require that alternatives analysis. And what we found is that for some challenges, for some of the potential projects, is we're not sure what we're even going to do before we can determine, well, what then is the best approach to replace the ozone generator, for example, or the best approach for a particular capital project if we're not sure exactly what we even want to do about it. And so what we found is through the, and this is, again, we just initiated this project for this initiative, that there's several studies that are coming out of this process where we need a study to determine what we want to do about this work. And that study might be internally driven by our planning and engineering staff, or it might be hiring a consultant. And so the charter clarifies that scope, that this project that we're requesting capital funds for is to hire a consultant to do the study. And the output of the study would be potential capital work that would go through the BCE process. And so the BCE starts at that 30% design.
Gotcha. Okay. So the charter comes before the BCE. Got it. Very
so
good.
Jenny, is your system planning group responsible for, are you like the overall process owner, or who is managing the overall process?
Yes, system planning is managing this overall process and is the overall owner of the intake, the forms, the training, and connecting with where the collaboration, the link between engineering and financial stewardship. Jeff?
So it sounds like I just wanted to clarify that there are some scoping decisions that are made before you go into the detailed business case evaluation. Is that correct? And you do it in different stages. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I see one other hand up.
Yeah, it's me, Jenny. Just a question on when is your project budget set, and when does that happen in relation to when the project manager gets assigned to the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are a biennium budget utility, and so the budget, so where we are now in the budget process is we are gathering as many intake submissions to get the charters developed as we prepare for our upcoming 2023-24 biennium budget. And so once all of these projects are the portfolio is developed, then that would go to financial stewardship in the spring. Then they go to our board for approval for funds. And the project manager is identified at different stages depending on the project and the project timing. So part of the review team, what they're doing is determining, is this work that we recommend happen as unplanned mid-biennium work. So work in this context that would happen next year. We're in a 21-22 biennium. So is this unplanned work that we didn't budget for? Or is this work that's planned for the upcoming biennium? Or is it future CIP work? And that is on the project charter that then gets evaluated and prioritized by system planning, and then evaluated and officially determined by our leadership team in planning and engineering. And depending on if it's unplanned work that would be happening the next biennium, that leadership team would then determine the project manager. But if it's future CIP work, a project manager wouldn't be identified until it's closer to that execution. And the goal is that we might be getting requests for work. We should really do something about this in 5 to 10 years. And we want to have some scope and schedule around that for our CIP as a placeholder, that as we get closer to that 5-year mark, then we would identify the project manager.
So do you have any issues with project manager buy-in or accountability? Because it sounds like they may not have a lot to do with the final control budget number, but they're handed that number to be accountable to, and to as an objective of their project, and the project will be measured on its success to meet that budget. But the project manager has not been involved in producing that budget number. Has that been an issue for you?
Well, I will say this is a new process, and so that question has come up, but I do think that it's very likely that the project manager would be part of that review team. So while technically they're not identified till later, if they're the subject matter expert for that particular work, it's likely that one of those review team members would become the project manager. But it depends on the project, because if there's a project identified for 5-6 years down the line, that project manager may not even be at our utility yet. So it really depends. That's something that we're going to kind of keep an eye on and see how that goes.
Jenny, I was looking for is your asset management or data and information incorporated into this this chart? Because I know that's part of your team.
That's a great question that we will save till the end.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'll keep going, and then I'm sure there's lots more questions, but I'll kind of get through what I've got here. So where did I leave off? So this is just what it looks like for our intake process, to show that it is on our SharePoint page, these links to the form, so anyone can fill this out. We really wanted our customers to be anyone in Tacoma Water that had a potential project idea. And you can see that in terms of a training perspective, we have several job aids and documentation that are publicly available about what's in our project charter, how to develop a project charter, the sponsor, how do you approve something in our new process. So as we launch this, it was very important to us to have lots of training materials all in one centralized location for all of our different stakeholders. I talked a little bit about the project charter. This is what it looks like for us, is that it is a summary document of just the who, what, where, when, and how much. And it's really a communication tool for customer management and financial stewardship to understand what projects we're potentially engaging in. You see there is a high level schedule, and this is to really identify that design expectation, when that's occurring and when execution would occur, because there's some key budget implications if design and construction's in the same biennium. So it's to identify that at a high level, as well as that budget and schedule confidence. So to the question that was asked, if you're being held accountable to this budget, the charter helps identify, well, when the review team met, what was their level of confidence that this was the appropriate budget? It could be that it was, we really aren't sure, and this is our best educated guess, or we're pretty certain that this is a good scope and or good budget and a good schedule. One of the other things here that was key for our financial stewardship and getting that support and buy-in was identifying how the work complemented our utility-wide strategic directives. And so those are listed here as an opportunity for alignment with just organizational strategic goals. So then for the project prioritization process, this was a bit new because in the current state, there really wasn't a formalized prioritization process, especially as the projects were initiated. And so for this process, when the customer submits the intake form, they are able to indicate constraints on the project and describe also the benefit of the project. And those are used later in the prioritization process. The review team, as they're creating the charter, will refine those constraints and refine the benefit. And this is helpful because the customer, at minimum, the review team is the person who submitted the form, the customer, and someone from system planning. And there's a likelihood that there would be other subject matter experts in there as well. And they're able to then clarify what are those constraints to the project. And constraints could be seasonal work, regulatory driven work, anything that could impede the scope, schedule, or budget. And then system planning, after the charter has been developed, applies a constraint and a value score. So a 1 through 5 score, and I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide too, but applies that 1 through 5 score, which helps then determine a priority score. And that priority score is just an Eisenhower matrix of that 1 through 5 on either axis. And then the leadership team is able to use that prioritization score to then plan the CIP and determine, have a conversation about when we want to do the work and allocate resources appropriately. And so a little bit more about that. The prioritization group developed first a one-pager prioritization guiding principles. And at Tacoma Water, we have 5 core values. And so this one-page document identified for planning and engineering, how do we operationalize those values? What does it mean for the work that we do to promote safety, for example? It's infrastructure projects that might impact water quality or employee safety, and that helped kind of identify what that matrix would look like. So the team that developed that one-pager then developed this rubric. And the rubric is for the system planning team to use to identify that 1 through 5 score. And so that 1 through 5 score has a consistent way of being applied. And that rubric is utilized, there's a rubric for value and a rubric for constraints. And so the constraints, again, are anything that might impede scope, schedule, or budget. And the value then is how closely aligned that project is to one of our 5 Tacoma Water values. And then that value score and that constraint score gives that project a red, yellow, or green. And to a question that was posed at the last meeting, this is not an algorithm. It was very important as we did our training that this does not determine this is the work we're going to do and this is the work we're not going to do, but it's just a starting point for discussion. It gives some level of analysis to say, okay, we have this many red projects. How do we want to achieve that and resource them? Where do we have flexibility? It gives the leadership team just a start of how they can allocate resources. Jeff.
And Jenny, that's really interesting. How do you or do you address urgency of an improvement? Sometimes you might have something that can create a really big impact, but it's slightly less urgent than something else that's really urgent, but you know what I mean? How does that play out?
That I think is captured in the constraints. And that was something that initially was what the access was called, was urgency, but we felt that it got confusing about urgency being it needs to be done immediately versus there's some sort of constraint to when the time of this could happen. Yeah, and that's also part of when the customer fills out the intake form, instead of asking, what biennium do you think this project should occur? It's when do you think this should happen? Right away, in the future, or not in the future, we just need to start planning it. It's more common lingo on the form. So we get just an initial gut check from that customer of that sense of urgency.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting challenge. We faced that over the years as well, that how to blend that in fairly.
Any other questions? All right, so our improvement plan goals. What do we want to do as we initiated our improvements? We wanted to leverage modern tools to provide equitable access to information that really is that cloud-based solution, as well as in this hybrid virtual and in the field environment. How can we use those tools to provide insight to what it is planning and engineering is working on? It was very important to us that our customers get status updates at key parts of the project initiation. We really were working with this idea of things when they come to engineering, it's not a black hole. And we were just very honest about that. And how do we kind of demystify what's happening in our engineering group? It was a high level of effort to train and support staff. So that's something as we went through the implementation that we were very cognizant of. And communicate. Our sponsor said, just as you think you're over communicating, you're probably approaching the right level of communication. So it was very important that all these changes, we were communicating in different ways to different audiences. So I'll show a little bit of what that looks like. I mentioned the concept of a black hole. We used that imagery of, we don't want to be a black hole, we want to be the Domino's pizza tracker. So that was the analogy as we implemented of telling our customers, we want to let you know where your pizza's at. So if you're familiar with the tracker, you have those 5 stages of when you know your pizza's on its way, it's in the oven, etc. Well, these are the key status updates for customers so that they know their requests are getting addressed. We've received your request, it's under review, the charter's complete, the sponsor's approved, and now initiate's complete, and here's where it landed. This is going to be unplanned work for the upcoming biennium, or it's on the slate for our budget request for the upcoming biennium, or it's on the future CIP. And that would be those key status updates for that customer, for the sponsor, for those that were involved with that project. And this is all publicly available to all of our Tacoma Water staff, so they have insight into what's going on. And this is what that looks like on our SharePoint. So we have, and this is all through Smartsheet, an intake number, what the request is, who requested it, and the status. And we also have what kind of project it is. So I didn't really touch on our private contract work and our main replacements, which at a prior meeting, Jonathan talked about those projects that already have funding. They're all tracked together here in this project tracker. So how does this complement the WISE integrations? So when I looked at the process map for WISE and that to-be state for CIP delivery, it's really in that identifying our needs stage that this is all aligned, especially on our training of the update of our process, because this was a whole new way of initiating work and identifying CIP work. We do not manage in our planning engineering group our CIP. We just manage 80 to 90% of what ends up on our CIP. So again, it's our financial stewardship that owns the full CIP process and BCE process. And we had to work together and collaboratively about how we identify the majority of that work. What we have on deck that Scott kind of alluded to is how do we take this other systems approach of our facility plans or asset management plans, all those other inputs, how do we incorporate that into how we prioritize the work? And so that's the next phase of this project. And then another area that we're still working on, that we've got some ground laid with our rubric on the prioritization process, but that's still something that we're refining as we get through our budget planning this year. So what's the training that we provided? We did provide review team training for those who are developing those project charters. So that was really important that those individuals had training, and that's where most of our project managers are in those review team trainings. We identified all the potential people who could be on a review team and offered 3 separate training sessions, recorded one. This is where it was just over communicate. This is what it's important to do. We also had info sessions for all of Tacoma Water about what these changes were, because we felt it was important that everyone in our organization understand how to initiate a project and just understand the process that we went through. Again, we offered 4 separate training sessions and recorded one. And then finally, our budget planning, and this gets to what Scott had asked earlier, and I'll allude to on the next slide as well. But the budget planning is for those project managers who typically submitted BCEs for capital projects. Our past state, this time of year, you would have individuals who would start drafting their BCEs, and that's how projects were identified for the upcoming year. It wasn't collected or collated in one systematic approach. And so we had to provide some training for them of what does this new future look like with our intake process and how capital projects are identified. And in this particular first kickoff, we introduced a new concept for Tacoma Water of using systems thinking, breaking down our Tacoma Water system into 12 subsystems to aid in our planning efforts. And so that would be our high service area, our low service area, our headworks and intake, and particular zones, predominantly organized around pressure zones, to identify 12 systems that we could then assess criticality of which system do we want to focus on, and is there a collection of projects in our intake in that particular system that we want to focus on for the upcoming biennium. What is the area? Just having that level of systems analysis. Scott.
I was just curious, is the financial management and those people involved in the intake and review process, or do you basically do that and then hand it off to them?
We do it and hand it off to them. And that was a strategic approach from the beginning. We do it and hand it off to them. That said, that roles and responsibilities group that identified and made that process map of the intake process and how it would flow, and our project charter, they were involved in the development of that. It was important from the very beginning that we included them, and that manager who then said, we love this project charter, we support this work. When we did our info sessions, we did them together, and it was communicated that this is our work sections working together to make this improvement. It would not have been a success if there was any resistance from that work group.
Yep.
Is their role then, Jenny, more of a review, that they review all the materials, including the business case evaluation, and say, yeah, we think you've made a good choice, or are they actually instigating the business case evaluations?
So their role is determining when a business case evaluation is required. So what is that dollar threshold, and whether or not design and construction's in the same biennium. So they have their own process map. And so we actually kind of like the stage gates of the WISE and the Signavio diagrams have, okay, this is the end of our process and it plugs directly into your process here.
Right.
And so for example, for unplanned work, the first step that they require is the project manager submits a project request form on their SharePoint site. And so that's where our process ends and their process begins. For the other work, the analogy that we've been using is you kind of have this shelf of all the projects that you have planned for the future that aren't unplanned work. And what they wanted is a snapshot of, okay, March 15th, here's our snapshot of the upcoming 2 years, but we see what's in 3 years and 5 years. And that was their big request, is we just want to not be surprised about that big, multi-million-dollar project that in engineering you think you're going to do, but it's not documented anywhere. That was their big goal. And so we were able to work with them to say the project charter is a lower barrier for us to develop for that future work that we could probably identify, versus the BCE was usually only initiated when that project was ready to go, when an engineer was like, I think we need to do this next year. So.
Do you have a third-party review for your business case evaluations, or is it just it comes back and
So for the business case evaluations, financial stewardship does review those. So I neglected to mention that. So for the project charters, they don't. For the project charters, though, that's internal to P&E. But once we get to that business case evaluation, those are reviewed by financial stewardship.
Right, they have a couple different roles. Okay, awesome, thank you.
So how's it going so far? It's a work in progress, but are you getting the buy-in and support that you want and need?
Yeah, I think so. So let me just, I think I got 2 slides left. And so I just wanted to show, this was our system planning workshop where we've divided up into our zones. And you can see we kind of use a sticky dot exercise with some questions to identify critical systems. And we identified, to the asset management point, our critical infrastructure in each of the systems, as well as some of our wholesale customers. And that helped identify those critical systems. So that's one thing. And then how are we successful? Because I think we were pretty successful. And it involved these 4 things when I think about how we managed to get the support and buy-in. From the very beginning, we use, if you're familiar with Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, it's this how, why, how, and what. You start with why. Why are we doing this? And internally, we added some employee and survey results that were related to what we call operational effectiveness, or why work things are done with undue delay. We had some improvement to do there. And so we kept hitting home with all of our training and info sessions of, we're trying to improve our operational effectiveness because employees have said that's where we want to improve. And so that was, starting with that why was really important. And then how was through the methodology of CI4I, and what were those 4 improvement teams. And so starting with why, I think, helped us, and having that clarity from January of 21 on of, this is why we're doing this. That over communication. So for the 4 improvement teams we had, I mentioned that was half of our engineering group was involved. So it was everyone from, engineering technicians to the section leads. And we would do every 6 weeks an all hands meeting where we would provide training and support over the tools that we use. And it was also an opportunity to update people on, here's where we're developing with prioritization. Here's what's working with our project filing structure, and having that information readily shared. The last bullet, that active engaged sponsorship, having a really engaged sponsor was critical because it allowed me to provide an update at every staff meeting every month, what we were doing and the improvements we were making. And then finally, this is my favorite, is show, don't tell. So we really focus on having that intake portal and things developed so that people could use them when we introduce them, and not just describe them conceptually. I think that's what I got, because I know I'm running out of time. So the last thing is just, it's iterative. You're not going to be perfect. So launch at 80% is kind of the motto of, it's not going to be at 100 when you want it to be. So just go. It's not a water filtration plant. It's a business project. So you don't need to worry about life safety when you're launching a project like this. And then involving those diverse stakeholders, I think, was really key as well. All right, I think that's all I got. I have more details in the slide deck just for those that are interested, which I can share, but that is what I wanted to share with you this morning.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
That was really good.
Fantastic job.
It was really good. Very informative.
Yeah, we've got a couple minutes if anybody has any other burning questions. But yeah, it was great. We had some good discussion and questions along the way. I guess, Jenny, one question I had is what level of involvement did you have of like your IT data analyst type resources, within your organization? I saw, SharePoint site and those kinds of things. Are those things you guys just already have out that are easy to set up and use, or?
Well, that is my role. So that's kind of what I was able to provide as our process analyst. I'm the person that people go to for all the SharePoint and Smartsheet and Tableau and all those kind of technologies. So that was all, I think, aided by my own expertise.
All right. Any other questions from the group? That was a fantastic update. So my
Really
thought is
nice.
like, Yeah, submit that presentation to a conference. Good gosh, you got some great stuff there.
It's a lot of work. I mean, I just can't say enough how important